Welcome back to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, and I'm here with my co host, Bettina Krause, editor of the finest magazine, Liberty Magazine, dealing with, you guessed it, religious liberty issues. And together we're trying to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. Now, today, we have a very pressing topic to talk about, and it has to do with a new policy that permits ICE to raid churches and schools. And we have two close friends with particular expertise to discuss the topic. Stephen Allred is an attorney and my partner in crime, as it were, uh, who is handling the legislative affairs work for the Church State Council. And Jason Mustard is a refugee from teaching and is an immigration attorney for a number of years, and also an old friend. So, Bettina, why don't you take it from there?
Sure. Well, we're delighted both of you could be with us today. And what we're trying to, I guess, establish first is what's changed. How has the law changed following the new administration's executive order on how immigration laws are enforced? And Jason, why don't we start with you?
Oh, well, yeah. So thanks for having me, first of all. In the past, the standing policy has always been that the government treated certain spaces as off limits for these sort of enforcement activities. And they would consider them, I'm trying to remember the exact term, is I believe they called them sort of safe spaces, or I mean, they just essentially they considered them off limits because of the sensitive nature of um, of those particular places. And churches and schools were right at the top of that list. The obvious reason being that, first of all, it looks just awful to carry out enforcement activities in places of worship due to the sacred nature of those spaces and the purpose of those spaces. And also, it's very look, and there's potentially a lot of issues with carrying out an enforcement action, a raid, in a place like a school where you have very like lots and lots of kids, young, impressionable, innocent people who um, would be understandably emotionally traumatized by that sort of activity. So um, that has been the standing policy. And in fact, throughout the first Trump administration, that policy, as I understand it, was respected and did not change. Um, and so that has been
Mhm.
the standing policy for, I believe, decades. And that is, we've had there have been cases, well documented cases of immigrants who took refuge in church facilities to avoid being, deported or or otherwise arrested. They would claim sanctuary in church facilities, and that was, I think in almost every situation that was respected because of the sensitive and sacred nature of that space.
Well, Jason, I think the exception to that rule goes back to the mid 1980s when the Reagan administration was funding the Contras in Nicaragua against a leftist government. And there were a lot of refugees coming to the US, and because of the politics, they were disfavored. And I know there were churches in southern Arizona that were providing sanctuary. And I know there was some litigation over ICE targeting of some of those churches. But that's like the one exception going back literally 4 decades, uh, you know, to the longstanding rule as you've said, but that's changed now, right?
Yeah, that. Yeah.
That restrictive policy has changed.
Yeah, I think my understanding is it's essentially, it's not to say that they are specifically targeting churches and schools, although I've read some reports that enforcement actions have included schools, including elementary schools in some places already. Um, but I think it's more to say that they're just essentially saying, look, if we decide that that's where we need to go, um, to carry out an activity to, apprehend someone that we're looking for, then we're not going to be restricted by this old policy anymore. If we need to go into a church, maybe even if you're having a worship service at the time, we will do that, right? Um, and I think it's sort of a no holds barred um, approach. They're essentially, I don't know how to say it exactly. I think that the idea is
The
the
gloves
gloves
are
are off.
off.
The gloves are off.
Yeah.
All that matters is enforcement activities now. Nothing else really matters, right? That's the idea.
I want to make a distinction here, though, because you framed it in terms of like going after an individual,
Yeah.
right? But uh, when you're looking at, for example, workplace raids, typically the workplace is expected to have, a group of undocumented immigrants. And so, you know, when I think of those raids, I don't think of them as targeting an individual. If you're targeting an individual, you don't need to go to church. If you know who they are, you know how to find them
Yeah.
outside of church, right? So to me, the whole notion of raiding a church is you have a congregation that you suspect has a number of undocumented immigrants, and that's where you're going to go. You're going to disrupt the service, and you're going to go check everybody's papers and try to round up those that you believe are undocumented, and
And
and that's just, I
I
think,
think that is the
pretty
worst case scenario,
offensive.
right? That is the worst case scenario. I mean, um, and I think that's certainly a possibility. I mean, I guess that would be the same worst case scenario in a school setting, right? Maybe even worse because there you're targeting kids who their parents aren't with them. They wouldn't have any documentation on their person that would show whether or not they have a process in place, that they've applied for some sort of visa status like asylum or U visa or something or anything else that would, potentially, help prevent being detained by ICE. I think that is the worst case scenario, that it would be a general raid, as you call it, on a church that is at worship or having some other kind of, you know, activity where there's a large congregation of people present. Um, I think I would hope that the intention of this change in policy is really more to send a message that, look, if somebody's going to try to claim sanctuary in a church now, that's not going to fly. Like, we're not going to let that hold us back. We're going to get a warrant. We're going to come in. But you're right. I mean, given the current approach and at least the rhetoric involved, um, I think that is something that churches need to be, prepared for, which is, I guess, why we're doing this today, is to try to help folks be more prepared for this sort of eventuality and possibility. Um,
So, we've been talking more of enforcement at more of a granular level. I want to take 2 or 3 steps back, or maybe 10 steps back, and just look at that change that this new administration policy, new executive order has brought in. Steve, you're an advocate for religious freedom. Does opening up houses of worship as potential places for enforcement of immigration laws, as the site of these kind of raids, does that raise in your mind any religious liberty concerns, any First Amendment constitutional concerns, any Religious Freedom Restoration Act concerns?
No, absolutely. And thanks for having me as well. Um, one thing I would point out about the discussion we were just having is that the previous policy, as I understand it, I was reading, I think it was the Biden administration's memo on this issue, still allowed ICE or whoever was enforcing to go into sensitive locations like churches and hospitals and schools, but only if they got permission from the higher ups. And if they were chasing a specific person, it was it was much more like there was a process involved for them to be able to go into those locations. So it seems like in this case now it's more like this. There's every place is the same. That's kind of the new approach here. It seems like. So it kind of makes you wonder what the ultimate goal is, as we were just discussing. But no, I think, Bettina, to answer your question, absolutely, it raises all of those issues. I mean, and in fact, I don't know if we want to discuss this now, but there has been a group of Quaker organizations on the East Coast who filed a lawsuit against this administration, and they have basically their arguments are this burdens our ability to practice our religion freely, and secondly, it has a chilling effect on our ability to associate. Under the First Amendment, the right of association, and they brought it under three different. The First Amendment, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and I think the Administrative Procedure Act as well, arguing that the Trump administration did not follow the process of changing the policy as they should have. It was just done without any reasoning, any time for public comments, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think their arguments are very good, and I think the idea is, hey, listen, if we're going to church and we're there to worship, and there's this idea hanging over our head that any moment, someone could burst into the room and stop that process to arrest someone. Obviously, again, if they're in hot pursuit of a criminal or something like that, that could happen anytime anyway. But this is a new thing. This is like, hey, you guys are kind of fair game for maybe like mass raids, like they do at workplaces sometimes. And so, their argument is for our undocumented members, or even those who aren't undocumented. Maybe they're just part of a minority group, but and there have been reports of minority groups who are being targeted just because of their ethnicity. They won't come to church. They're not going to want to worship. It has a chilling effect. It's a burden on their religious exercise.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my brain here, Steve, as far as chilling effect. And I wonder if either one of you can explain why that is a constitutional concern. That it doesn't prevent people from exercising their constitutional rights, but it puts them in fear of doing so that they refrain from exercising. And we're already getting reports of uh, people staying home from work, from school, from church because they're afraid. And, I think, for those listeners who are unsympathetic to folks who come to this country and lack legal status, um, talk about the impact not just on the undocumented, but on the community as a whole, family members, those who are citizens, those who have legal documentation, because it doesn't just affect the undocumented, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would think, in my practice, obviously, we work with a number of different areas of immigration law, including employment visas, and we do work in the courts of deportation defense. But I'd say the bulk of our work, or at least a large percentage of what we do, is family based immigration, and we have. I know from experience, but also from the documentation is out there that an incredibly large number of people who are here who maybe don't have a visa status or don't have a current visa status, um, are they have U.S. citizen spouses or legal permanent resident spouses. They have spouses sometimes that have a visa status and they don't. They often have children who are U.S. citizens. There is any number of different types of American families, and there's just a very large number of American families who have one or more folks in their family that are undocumented. And so um, oftentimes there are processes available to those people. But for whatever reason, they may not have started the process, or they may be in a process, which, many of the visa processes that we do now, since COVID, are taking somewhere on the order of 4 to 6 years longer than they were before COVID, right? And so that's just the nature of how government agencies have, or at least the immigration agencies, are functioning in the last 5 to 10 years. Things have only gotten slower, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in the immigrant community because they are scared about being separated from their family. They are scared about being, um, split apart from their kids and whatnot. And I will tell you that a very large number of these folks, no matter what, they will be able to immigrate to the United States one way or another, based on family immigration. But there could be years and years of separation in the intermediate time that's really unnecessary, right? And that's, I think, with the enforcement priorities that we have now, I think that's going to be more and more of a reality. We're going to see more and more people separated from their children, often very young children who are citizens, um, and their spouses, or their parents, their siblings, right?
Right.
There's a lot of, I mean, most, I would guess, I would say most of the people here have some family members, who have some sort of status. Either they're citizens, or they're permanent residents, or they're here in another visa status. The
Right.
large percentage of people coming to seek asylum in the United States, one of the reasons they come to seek asylum in the United States is because they have a network here already. They have family who are here that they can live with. They have aunts and uncles and grandparents who, can provide them with that support network that they need. They don't all just come to the United States because we're the United States. That is, there's a lot of reasons, and a lot of times that is family.
Right. Right. And we've seen a lot of statements coming out over the past 10 days or so from religious denominations, affirming exactly that. This is a very complex area of law. There are many different visas that people come in on. Um, Pastors are not standing at the church door checking papers, whether it's a Christian church or whether it's, a synagogue or whatever. People are welcome to come and worship regardless of what their immigration status is. The church that I represent, the Seventh day Adventist Church, recently made a statement of that kind as well. So, I'm guessing you both have some wisdom for pastors, leaders of houses of worship, should they encounter law enforcement wanting to come onto their property to enforce immigration law. What are some of the general principles that pastors should keep in mind? And maybe Steve, why don't you lead off in this?
Sure. I think, starting from a kind of a general level, I think the first thing is that church leaders need to have some sort of a plan. So getting together ahead of time and saying, what are we going to do if immigration enforcement comes to church or comes to our church school? Make sure you consult with your legal counsel if you have one in your organization, your church organization, and talk about kind of what your stance is, and how you're going to approach this issue to begin with. I know that another good idea is to probably have one or two people who are designated as the people to kind of interact with the authorities if they do come onto your premises. If you've got a bunch of church members all with their own positions, talking to them and things like that, it could be chaotic. And, I think you mentioned Bettina a memo from the North American division of the Seventh Day Adventist Church, and I think there's some good advice there that they're trying to limit potential liability to the church, perhaps from different angles. Um, and another some other good advice I've heard is listen, if you have people coming onto your property, doesn't matter who they are. Generally, churches are private property, right? Uh, Private schools are as well, and you can limit access to certain areas. Now, um, you can distinguish between public and private areas. You can, um, basically, and let me get to kind of more of the specific in a second. I think one other thing too, I would say, is to formulate a plan for what happens to children of undocumented persons who might attend your church or school if their parents are detained, because I think that could be a problem. We don't know. And, again, that's part of the kind of the planning process. There are some really good know your rights presentations out there if churches do want to provide those to their church members or the people that attend. They don't have to. I don't think churches should be in the um, work of giving legal counsel per se, but there are some good third parties that can provide information that can be given to church members and so on and so forth. Um, so back to the private property issue again, and then I'd love to hear from Jason on this too, because I'm sure he'd have some good things to say. But churches are open to the public usually during certain times of the week. And yet, if someone is disruptive and they come onto your church campus, you still have the legal right to expel them. Like any member of the public, immigration agents can enter without a warrant into public areas that are open to the public. This doesn't necessarily give them the authority to talk to, question, or arrest people. And in most instances, churches are within their legal rights to ask them politely to leave if they don't provide a warrant that's signed by a judge or a magistrate. But even if they do present a warrant, I think the best practice is to say, I don't consent to this. We don't consent to this, but you're not going to obstruct them from carrying out their mission. So that's, I think, an important thing. We're not telling people here to get themselves arrested. I'm sure that some Christians might view this as an area to exercise civil disobedience, and that is between them and, their conscience and their church organization. But we're going to give you what we think is the best advice here for you. Other advice I've heard is, listen, if they're searching for a particular individual or individuals, don't try to help them escape or anything like that, because you could then, be considered obstructing justice. And here's the other thing. If the agents come to you and say, hey, help me find the undocumented people here in this place. I know I go to a congregation where we have a Spanish-speaking congregation that meets in another part of the church. And, probably undocumented people go to a lot of some of these churches. Who knows, right?
Well, we
If they
do know, actually.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we do know. If they ask you to point them out, you don't need to do that, right? You can remain silent, and you can simply say that you choose to remain silent. Of course, the good and that is good advice pretty much in a lot of situations. Anytime you're interacting with law enforcement, and of course, if you're detained or arrested, you have the right to seek the counsel of an attorney. And if you don't have one, you can say, I want to speak to an attorney, and they can, of course, provide you with that as well. So that's some general, I think there are some specific things as well we could talk about, but that would kind of, I think, be a general overview.
Jason, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think Steve covered a lot of that well. I mean, it is obviously a fine line, and I think one of the best things people can do, especially those in leadership in church communities, is to make sure that they are prepared, that they're thinking proactively about this, like Steve said, and that they familiarize themselves with some of the general information whether they need to speak with their own counsel or even if they, at the very minimum, want to review some of the information that's out there. I would mention that there are a lot of organizations like the ACLU and the American Immigration Lawyers Association that have flyers, PDFs that are available online, that know your rights flyers that speak to different scenarios where a person might encounter immigration enforcement, and to make sure that those individuals know that what their rights are um, in those encounters, and make sure that they are fully aware of the, like, the basic fact that they have the right to remain silent. You know, um, they don't have to say anything, and I think, and they don't, certainly don't have to sign anything. You know, we one of the things that we mention when we speak with folks a lot is, you know, they may be given something and told to sign something, and they absolutely do not have to sign anything. And because often what will happen is someone is being presented with you know, a paper that says, "I agree to be removed from to an expedited removal from the country." In other words, I'm not going to try to fight for a chance to stay here by applying for some sort of relief that might be available to me, depending on the facts of my case. And so people feel like, well, the officer told me I had to sign this, so I signed it. And they don't know what they're signing, but in fact, they're signing something that says they're signing away their rights. Um, and so I think that just knowing that, sort of that basic information is key. You know, for leadership in these communities, whether it's a church or a school or a hospital, or who, you know, however these sensitive areas, these folks involved with these sensitive places, it's important to be prepared, and because, you know, there are these realities that we're looking at now, and that's the best way. I always tell my clients before court or before an interview, I said, look, the better prepared you are, the more organized you are, the less stress you're going to feel in an already stressful situation. Right. So it really is. People say, well, what can I do now? And it's the first step is be prepared. Make sure your people are prepared. Right.
And I would add to that, I think, families ought to have a plan as well, not just churches, right? So, what happens if mom and dad get taken when the kids are at school, or whatever, vice versa? Um, I think that's an important thing. Another quick thing that I think is probably an important thing to mention, if you know, s- if law enforcement's, or in this case, immigration enforcement's coming into a church setting, or even if someone's out in public, a question to ask, first of all, don't run, because that's going to make you look guilty, right? And but you can ask, am I free to leave? And that's an important thing. And if they say yes, then you can leave, right? If they say no, then you're being detained, and that's when you might want to ask for legal counsel and assert your right to remain silent.
Well, we're about out of time for this first segment. Our goal is to do another segment. This has been really, really helpful. And I think one of the takeaways for me is there's just as much divisiveness over these immigration issues in churches as in the broader society, right? So it's really incumbent upon churches to really be prepared to know and have a unified approach as to what they're going to do. And I just would also make this observation. I know that in Los Angeles, for example, within our own denomination, there are 42 different language groups meeting on a given Sabbath for worship. You know, we have a very diverse country and church. It's been that way for a long time. We think of this as primarily focusing on Latino folks, but it impacts many, many different communities. It's really broad. Now, obviously, LA is going to be more diverse than some other places, but I think that just kind of illustrates the scope of the problem. So
Yeah, I think this has been a good discussion, and I think we have a lot more to discuss. So next week, let's take up the same subject. So, Alan, I mean, that discussion, especially around whether this whole change in immigration enforcement policy poses religious liberty questions, I think that is a fascinating one. It raises a lot of important constitutional questions, and especially that Quaker case. I will be
uh-huh.
very interested to see what sort of traction that gets in the courts. Do you have any gut feeling on that?
Well, I mean, I'm rooting for the Quakers. I don't mind, saying that. I do think that uh, this policy has created fear,
Yeah.
and it has become, I mean, an opportunity for, warrantless stops, pretexts, and racial profiling, and all of that. And people are afraid. Um, and so, to the extent that they're afraid to go to church, that's kind of our particular bailiwick here is religious freedom, and that's a problem. In a free society, people should not feel like they're afraid to go to church. So, and that's really the crux of the Quaker case.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Alan. We'll have more to say on that in future episodes. But for now, that's it for Just Liberty today. I'm Bettina Krause with Alan Reinach. And remember, eternal vigilance is a price of liberty.